Hi, this is Jennifer Rubin. I am so excited to have with us Brian Klaas. Brian is the author of the hit book Fluke, which actually changed the way I look at life, at predictability, at causation, at a lot of different things. He is a new citizen of the UK and he is a professor at College of University of College London. Excuse me. Brian, so nice to have you. Thanks for making time for us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here and always to chat with you.
So, you have been looking into a timely subject, which is rich people. What have you found out about the role of rich people in society? And has that changed since the days of the robber barons?
Yeah, so if you take the longer view, and we're talking about the sort of thousand-year trajectory of rich people in Western society, Christian theology used to sort of view rich people with skepticism, right? If you'd hoarded wealth, you had committed sins. And so this is sort of like what thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and so on think about rich people. And there's a shift. This comes from a historian named Guido Alfani, who wrote a great book about the history of rich people in the West, where he says after the Black Death, there sort of becomes this social contract where the rich people are supposed to do two things. They're supposed to invest in civic benevolence, right? This sort of patrons and builders of the arts and cathedrals and all these sorts of things that we have shared interests in as a society. And they're also supposed to hoard wealth for a rainy day. He basically says they act like barns of money, right? So in the same way that barns store grain in case there's a famine, the rich were there to have money on hand so when something really bad happened, society could tap into it. And they coerced them to do this. They forced them to basically give the money up when calamities struck. And so the thesis of this book, which I think is fascinating, is that over time those norms eroded. And so what I've been writing about recently is this notion that instead of patrons, we have plutocrats who, rather than investing in cathedrals, are building super yachts where, it's not for the public benefit, it's for private wealth and sort of grotesque opulence and so on. And instead of crises being places where we tap into wealth in order to have shared benefit and mitigate suffering, the super rich got way wealthier from things like COVID, right? And Elon Musk is the illustration of this. So I think there's this sort of bizarre warping of the incredible inequality in society where we let these people run government and we've lost sight of the fact that there's supposed to be a social purpose to anyone who accrues massive wealth. And we've just ignored that. And I think it's a long overdue correction that we have to think more carefully about this.
For the industrial age, a lot of this wealth was concentrated in monarchies and the church, and they seem to take over those kind of structures. When the Industrial Revolution came along and you had the nouveau riche, the suddenly very rich, that seemed to be one change. And you go from the court of so and so's king to Carnegie and Rockefeller and Ford and the rest. Talk a little bit about that and how those people thought of their role in society. On one hand, they made gobs of money and exploited labor. On the other hand, they left something behind.
Yeah, so there's not supposed to be some sort of whitewashing of the rich throughout history. I mean, they were always self-interested. They always took advantage of social norms and so on. But the social structures around them forced them to give stuff back. So, a great example, again, Alfani points to this in this book. It's an excellent book called As Gods Among Men. And what he points to two great examples. One of them is JP Morgan, who's, got a huge amount of money, but basically acts as a banker of last resort in 1907 to rescue the American economy. And he basically taps into his resources to do this. And then there's also the Liberty bonds going into World War One, which turned out to be a terrible investment, right? These left people a lot less wealthy than they used to be, but they viewed it as a public duty to basically reduce their wealth in order to help the country. And I just, this is the kind of stuff where it almost seems quaint. Like we have these calamities that continually befall us. And then what do? We lower taxes on the rich. We have fewer roles of sort of responsibility. And anytime that there is a way in which we talk about this stuff, they often kick back quite hard that they're overtaxed and all this sort of stuff, and they'll never be able to afford their yacht if they have, a marginal tax rate that's above 38%, and remember in World War II, the top marginal tax rate was 94%, which is unthinkable today. And so, the other thing that I think is really interesting is there's this quote from G.K. Chesterton, is an author from the early 1900s, and he said in this quote he says, the poor have an invested stake in society, whereas the rich can sail away to New Guinea on their yacht. And I think it's really profound because in the past, the robber barons may have been robber barons, but they lived in the country, right? Like if New York collapsed, this was bad for them. And I think we have a new class of people who are so mobile, whether it's on their yachts or now with rocket ships and all this stuff, that they just view social dysfunction as something they can escape. And that's what I worry about is that there's this aspect where the oligarchs just think, well, if society collapse, I'll just go somewhere else. And that is the kind of stuff where I just think the unsustainability of this, combined with the fact that these people are now running the government quite literally with the keys to, financial systems and all these things that Elon Musk has taken over in the last 2 weeks. I think it's time to have a social debate about the responsibilities that come with hundreds of billions of dollars.
Absolutely. Now, I think of Silicon Valley in particular, that we've created almost a group of stateless people. They don't seem to identify as Americans. They are globalists in the worst sense of the world. And they see governments as impediments to them. And as a result, they don't have a particular loyalty to the United States, to democracy, to democratic values. Is that something that's been gradual, or did that have a jump start because of the technological and electronic digital age?
I think it's globalization. I mean, this is one of the points that I made around the war in Ukraine, is that if you wanted to put pressure on Putin's oligarchs, you needed to make their lives more Russian, right? You needed to basically make it so the fates of Russia were twinned with their own fates, where for many of them, that wasn't the case, right? They lived in the Mediterranean, sailing around on these enormous, ridiculously sized, half-billion-dollar vessels and so on. And it's astute that you point out the sort of tech bros, as it were, because some of them have developed more explicit ways of pushing back against philanthropy in terms of the traditional sense of like what we think of with the Gates Foundation, where they actually have spent money to help, poor people. And Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel, for example, Peter Thiel, they have these examples where Andreessen basically says something to the effect of investing in technology is inherently philanthropic by a 50-to-1 margin because it helps people way more than just giving money, right? And I've been to some of the poorest places in the world, like Madagascar, I do a lot of work in. And I will tell you that none of those people use Andreessen's social media platform Ning, right? What they do need is food and medicine and healthcare and vaccines and all these other things. And that aspect, and it's sort of on the nose what you asked about this, the ways in which the mobility plays into this, because Peter Thiel had a major donation to something called the Seasteading Institute, it has this bizarre vision of like seeding cities and city-states on the ocean as sort of this like libertarian utopia. And when I came across this, I was writing, I was like, this is so much of a caricature, right? Because it's not just enough to have the super yacht, where when the pandemic hits, you just get on your, private boat and don't have to worry about these problems. It's that you actually want to build a sort of floating society free of taxes and social obligations. And, I don't like paying taxes as much as anyone else, but I also think that taxes are the bedrock of a decent society. And,
Right.
it's one of those aspects where I just despair at how this sort of siphoning of wealth has come with a ideology in which these people think they've earned 100% of it. They owe nothing to anyone. And that when the inconvenience of a government comes knocking, they'll just move somewhere else. I mean, yeah,
Right.
it's terrible.
Americans, Americans seem to have this love-hate relationship with billionaires. On the one hand, everyone thinks they too could become a billionaire, and they admire these self-made men. They make them into heroes. But then when they see them, there's a lot of resentment against the rich. How does that figure in all of this? And has that changed over time? Are Americans sort of becoming less and less hostile to the rich, or are they becoming more hostile to the rich?
I think there's a bifurcation, right? I mean, I think there is a lot of people on the political right who view billionaires not just as aspirational, but as people who must be geniuses because they're
Yes.
wealthy, right? And so the solution to all our problems is to just turn to the richest person that exists, and that's Elon Musk, and then we'll just turn over the government to him, and surely everything will magically be fixed. On the left, you have much more skepticism towards billionaires and sort of an understanding of inequality and all the problems that have. And there is something really grotesque about Elon Musk boasting about killing off USAID, which helps the poorest people in the world as he's got $400 billion of net wealth. And I despair at that. But um, I think that aspirational stuff is baked into our culture.
Yeah.
It's a part of the American dream. I used to work in campaign politics. I co-managed a campaign for governor in Minnesota, and we talked about the candidate that I worked for, who's named Mark Dayton. He used to talk about raising taxes on the richest 10% of Minnesotans in order to solve the budget deficit. And what we realized that was fascinating in the polling is that when we asked people that, more than 50% were opposed to it because they thought they were in the richest 10% already.
Or
And
they
then
could be
another,
in the richest 10%.
yeah, and then another group thought they weren't in the richest 10%, but that they would be, right? So you were alienating all these people. And what was amazing was when we switched the statement just to the pure dollar amount, which was something, this was in 2010, right? So it's a while ago. It was something like 350 grand a year before you even saw a tiny increase in your taxes. All of a sudden the sort of messaging shifted because people realized I'm nowhere near this, or even if I am aspirational at that stage, I could afford to pay a little bit more if I need to, et cetera. So I think there is something about talking about just the sheer amount of money that $1 billion is. And like, you know, as I said, one of the countries I work in, Madagascar, is 30 million people. The total economic output for the country is $10 billion.
Hmm.
So, the average person there makes $500 a year. Elon Musk has 40 times what the entire country has for 30 million people in terms of his net wealth. Does anyone need that? I mean, is his life going to be marginally better if he has 400 rather than 399 billion? I think that's something where, I'm not for just seizing wealth. I believe in markets and so on. But I also think there has to be a discussion about what is the society we want to engineer, and what are the economic and tax policies that would provide that. And given the grotesque inequality, I think we need some new ideas. And Democrats can be articulating those even as they are out of government to provide a vision for
Absolutely.
what it might look like.
And that's a great segue because I did want to talk a little bit about what we do about this. One of the added barriers to solving this problem is that the tech billionaires run tech, they run social media platforms. So they kind of generate misinformation, disinformation, excuses for themselves. They put their fingers on the scale. Given that, given that our campaign finance laws, as currently structured, and maybe that's where we begin, tend to invest in very wealthy people enormous power. How do we begin to shift the balance? How do ordinary people begin to start the discussion that it's not that we don't want rich people, it's that we want responsible people? And do they really need to be that rich? How does that process get underway? We've seen it before in society when we went from the robber barons to the progressive era. How do we do that again?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I mean, in the short term, there's not much that Democrats can do to pass legislation, right? So that's not going to happen at least for the next few years. But they can start to articulate what society might look like in this realm. And I think there is, a groundswell for populism, not to go after the rich as some sort of class warfare or vindictive aspect, but just to say that we need to engineer systems that either incentivize significantly more philanthropy or have taxation that is commensurate with the needs of society, given that we have a series of crises that are only going to get worse. In the shorter term, one of the things that I think that maybe one of the most direct ways that people can push back against the Trump sort of nexus is, blue states and blue voters, which are 50% of the country and have a lot of wealth, can start to use their wealth in strategic ways. And I think, this is one of those areas where I've been surprised at how corporate America has moved so quickly to just sort of fall in line with Trump-like initiatives. There needs to be a cost to that, right? At some point, you need to put your money where your values are, and try to sort of separate out the things that create aggregations of wealth that are so extreme among people who are politically destructive. And it's harder to do because the structures of the economy. I mean, it's very easy to click the button and order, something from Amazon. It's very easy to buy a Tesla, when you're looking for an electric car. But I think there are aspects of this where the small choices that consumers make add up to these sort of seemingly consequence-free actions for someone like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, et cetera, where I think a little bit of the pushback would be healthy as an interim step.
Well, I can attest that when you leave a company owned by a billionaire and strike out on your own, it is a lot of work, but it is very rewarding. So perhaps we all have to kind of start closest to home and figure, are we part of the problem or are we part of the
I,
solution?
I was skirting around this, but I think you have done very well in this regard.
Thank you. Thank you. Brian, I hope our audience can tell how interesting Brian is. One of the most interesting conversationalists and social scientists I think that we have out there. And we appreciate your coming. We'll be sure to have you back. And we want to share more of you with our contrarian community. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, and what an exciting platform you've built. So great to be here. Thank you.